Trump is back as U.S. president. Putin is still under heavy pressure from the international community. And the war in Ukraine, more than 3 years old by this point, is still dragging on with no clear end in sight. That's the backdrop for what became one of the most dramatic diplomatic moments of 2025, the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Anchorage, Alaska. Why Alaska? At first, the choice sounded strange. Why not Washington or New York, or even a European capital? But the reasoning was actually very calculated. Alaska sits right between Russia and the United States, geographically closer to both sides. And even more important, Alaska is outside the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. That meant Putin, who still faces an ICC arrest warrant over alleged war crimes, could attend without fear of being detained. Symbolism, security, and legal safety, all in one package. The decision already raised questions before the summit even began. Was the United States giving Putin a free pass by choosing such a location? Or was this simply the only way to get him to the table? When Putin arrived, the spectacle was pure theater. He stepped off his plane onto a red carpet rolled out on U.S. soil. The reception was carefully staged. There was music, military presence, and, for a touch of symbolism, a bomber flyover in the skies above. Cameras captured every second. And then the image that shocked everyone. Trump and Putin sharing not only a handshake, but also a ride in the Beast, the heavily armored U.S. presidential limo. The visual was powerful. For Putin, it projected legitimacy, an appearance as an equal partner to the U.S. president. For Trump, it sent a message. He was in control of the stage, welcoming Putin on his own turf. But for many around the world, the picture raised unease. Was this really about diplomacy or about performance? Now, the meeting itself. Originally, it was supposed to be just the two men, one-on-one, behind closed doors. Many people expected a private showdown, two strong personalities, no filters, no witnesses. But that didn't happen. Instead, both brought in key aides. On the U.S. side, Senator Marco Rubio, a leading voice in foreign policy, joined Trump, along with Steve Witkoff, one of Trump's close allies. On the Russian side, Putin was joined by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and longtime advisor Yuri Ushakov. That alone changed the dynamic. A one-on-one could have allowed for more direct talk. With aides present, everything became more formal, more measured, and perhaps more cautious. Another surprise, the length of the talks. These summits often drag on for hours. The schedule suggested 6 to 7 hours of intense discussion. Instead, the meeting wrapped up in less than 3. That short duration shocked observers. It suggested one of two possibilities. Either they reached a quick understanding, or they found little common ground and decided not to waste time. Inside those talks, the biggest issue was, of course, Ukraine. Trump came in pushing for a ceasefire as the first step. That had been his consistent line since returning to the White House. Stop the fighting, then work out the details. But something shifted in Alaska. After speaking with Putin, Trump's tone changed. He began talking less about a ceasefire and more about a direct peace deal. In other words, instead of freezing the war temporarily, he seemed more open to negotiating a final settlement, something closer to Putin's position. Putin, meanwhile, floated a very specific offer. He said Russia would agree to freeze the current front lines in southern Ukraine, including Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. But in exchange, Ukraine would have to give up its claim to Donetsk. That was a non-starter for Kyiv. President Zelenskyy and his government made it clear Ukraine would not concede territory in exchange for peace. This is where things became complicated. For Trump, the appeal of a deal was clear. He has always presented himself as a deal maker, someone who can cut through years of conflict and find a solution. But for Ukraine and for much of Europe, the danger was just as clear. Any peace deal that locks in Russia's territorial gains risks rewarding aggression and undermining international law. When Trump and Putin emerged to face the press, the contrast between style and substance was striking. Trump called the talks extremely productive. He said many points were agreed upon, but he admitted there's no deal until there's a deal. It was his way of saying progress had been made, but nothing was final. Putin's language was similar. He described the talks as constructive, saying they could be the beginning of a process, a starting point for both peace in Ukraine and a reset of U.S.-Russia relations. But outside that press hall, the reaction was very different. European leaders moved quickly. Within hours, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, Poland, and Finland, along with the European Union, issued a joint statement. They said plainly, any agreement on Ukraine must involve Ukraine. President Zelenskyy cannot be sidelined. And they stressed that Ukraine's sovereignty and its path toward NATO and the EU must remain intact. This pushback showed the fragile balance Trump now faces. On one side, he wants to showcase his ability to deliver results with Putin. On the other, he cannot afford to alienate European allies or appear to pressure Ukraine into concessions. So where did the summit leave things? No ceasefire, no peace treaty, no major breakthrough. Trump admitted it directly. We didn't get there. But it wasn't a total failure either. Both leaders signaled that talks would continue. And the next chapter is already unfolding. Zelenskyy is scheduled to fly to Washington to meet Trump directly. There is also discussion of a larger summit that could involve European leaders, putting Ukraine back at the center of the process. The Alaska meeting may be remembered less for what it achieved and more for what it revealed. It showed how Trump is willing to shift positions quickly, moving closer to Putin's vision of negotiations. It showed how Putin is still trying to freeze the conflict on terms favorable to Russia. And it showed how Europe is determined to hold the line on Ukraine's independence. For ordinary people watching, the emotions were mixed. On one hand, there was a sliver of hope. At least the two men were talking. At least there was movement. On the other, there was fear. Fear that the talks could lead to a deal that sacrifices Ukraine's future or that fails to bring real peace at all. One way to look at the Alaska meeting is like the first episode of a new season. The story isn't resolved, but the pieces are moving. Trump and Putin shook hands, exchanged words, and set the stage. Now the real question is what comes next and whether those future talks bring peace or more division. For Alaska itself, the summit was historic. It was the first U.S.-Russia summit on American soil since the late 1980s. For one day, a state known for snow, salmon, and mountains became the center of global politics. And for the world, it was a reminder that diplomacy often moves slowly, in small steps. Big moments like this create headlines, but the real outcome takes shape in the quiet follow-up meetings, the long negotiations, and the choices leaders make after the cameras are gone. The Trump-Putin meeting of August 15th, 2025 did not end the war. It did not deliver peace, but it mattered. It showed the stakes. It showed the strategies. And it reminded everyone that history is being written not in one dramatic day, but in the steps that follow.